Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Paul Tunner. I'll be moderating today, and the topic is, can AI reveal real-time insights? I think we'll get more than a yes or no from our panelists. Now, as we're letting people jump in, we're going to start with a poll. We'd like to understand your current level of proficiency in insight in the context of AI. So you'll see that pop up. You can vote away, and we're going to be very intrigued to see what the results look like on that. So while you're voting, let me just say thank you to Reuters for the opportunity to moderate today. Thank you to Within3 for sponsoring today's webinar. And I'm going to briefly introduce my panel. I won't give them big intros. I'll let them introduce themselves when they speak. But we have with us here today Lance Hill from Within3, Neeraj Mittal from GlaxoSmithKline, Nate Lear from AstraZeneca, and Carlos Eid from Novartis. And they'll all be sharing their experience of using AI within the field of insights. You can, of course, ask your questions as we go through. Please do that in the Q&A panel, and you can put your name against your question if you wish to do so, or you can be anonymous. You can direct your question to one of our panelists if you choose to do so. We will try and get through as many questions as we can. We've already had some come in before the webinar, so I can't promise we'll get through all of them, but we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. And I see some interesting voting coming in on that poll already. It seems fairly evenly split, perhaps less people saying you are expert or needs improvement at either end. Most people seem to feel they are proficient or in building mode when it comes to insight in the context of AI. We'll also explore the real-time aspect as we go through the webinar today as well. So I think without further ado, and for the agenda today, we'll have Lance presenting first of all, setting the scene. Then we'll have a Q&A with our panel where I'll feed in your questions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lance to set the scene. Lance, over to you.
All right, perfect. Let me go ahead and get us started. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So everyone, I'm Lance Hill. I'm the CEO and founder of Within3. My background is a technologist. I went to college many years ago for computer engineering. And what I'm passionate about is how technology solves real problems. I've been focused on life sciences for the past 20 years and building solutions to help in and around this insights problem across the continuum. So just to set the stage, as Paul was mentioning, what I'd like to do is cover a couple of things quickly, a case study, a quick primer on insights and what we're talking about, what we mean by those terms, and artificial intelligence, a way to think about how AI has been affecting this particular space. And then it's going to be, I think, a great panel discussion after that. So by way of case study, this is a case study of a medical affairs leader who joined an organization to help with a product that had been in the market for about 2 years. And the issue was that while the solution had better clinical efficacy than the current standard of care, adoption of the therapy was much slower. And also medical affairs, part of the reason for the leadership change was medical affairs was not really being perceived in the organization as kind of a change agent and driving a lot of value in helping with this issue. And like many organizations, there was, and as the medical leader started to dive into what could be behind this slower than expected therapy adoption, there was a lot of information siloed through different parts of the organization, from the field, information from congresses, online social listening, advisory boards, medical information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the goal was, how do we mine all this information, understand what's really happening in the marketplace at large? Is our strategy correct? Obviously, something's not working, and how do we need to change that strategy? And so the goal of this leader was to implement an AI-based insights solution to try to help them solve that particular problem. So we'll come back to that in a second. From a quick primer perspective, in this context, what we're talking about is insights management as it pertains to understanding kind of the overall marketplace, the overall disease community. And the way that sort of insights process works is really a 4-step easy process. There's some sort of strategy that you have, commercial or medical. You're gathering data and observations through those different sources, one-on-one interactions with HCPs or patients or payers, online listening, advisory boards, et cetera, medical congresses. You're analyzing all that information to then determine what are those insights, what should you do next. You're communicating that to the organization, taking those actions, hopefully achieving some impact, and then the process kind of loops and continues. That's kind of an easy four-step process. One note I'll make is in this context, an observation is not the same as an insight. So if I meet with Dr. Paul on a one-on-one meeting, he might say something very interesting. That might tell me something about Dr. Paul, but I need to really compare that to what I've heard from everyone else in the marketplace as well to see, is that an insight? Quite simply, an insight is an aha moment, something that you've learned that either validates your current strategy is correct, tells you your strategy is incorrect, or surfaces something that should be part of your strategy that you weren't even aware of. That's kind of an insight versus just field notes in a CRM. Is really data and observations as opposed to insights by themselves. So let's talk about AI and set the stage there for this part of the conversation. So in the insights mode, again, these are insights as it pertains to understanding the overall marketplace and disease community. There have really been three waves of AI-based approaches to try to solve this problem, really starting in around 2015, 2016. And each of these three generations of AI approaches has made the process run faster and have more impact, be more effective. So the first generation is really office productivity tools, very little AI. So this is the idea that we have a bunch of field notes in a CRM, we download those into a spreadsheet, we analyze those manually to see what people are saying, what we're learning. We collate that into some set of insights. We then build a PowerPoint and a report. We put that into the PowerPoint and report, and we share that with folks, and we kind of run the process that way. So this sort of approach is what you see a lot of smaller organizations, small biotechs, where they don't have a lot of volume of information to sift through, works very well for them. And then larger organizations where there's not really been a huge investment in different approaches, where people are doing what they can with the tools they have at hand, which are typically these office types of tools. The second approach of AI really started in like 2017, 18, is what I call dashboard AI. So what this does, a lot of the information that we're analyzing for insights is free text. It's taking a note of what someone said online, what someone said to you in person, what's happening at a congress, etc. And so what dashboard AI does is it takes free text, uses natural language processing, sentiment analysis, these sorts of AI models, and tries to basically understand that text and group it into categories or buckets that we can then measure and trend over time. And so this is what our product looked like in 2021, but this is just kind of a set of what that sort of process does. It takes all these words and says, oh, what's being discussed around the disease area, what's being discussed around mechanisms of action, what's being discussed around unmet need, whatever these concepts are, and then groups them, and then you can kind of trend them and see, people saying positive things, negative things, etc. And what that second generation of AI does is it really helps this problem in the middle. We have all this data and information. How do we analyze it more quickly? The challenge with the second generation is it's still very expensive and costly to implement. First, it doesn't cover the whole process. It doesn't help you gather anything necessarily, and certainly doesn't help you really communicate or drive impact. And you still have to kind of build the dashboards, mine all the data, analyze it, organize all that together. So while it really helps with this box in terms of analysis, it's still left a lot of steps. So the third generation of AI is what I call combined AI. It combines those sorts of models and algorithms, but also adds generative AI capability to it as well. That allows the system, instead of building dashboards and trying to communicate dashboards, what it does is in plain language, it understands your medical or commercial strategy, analyzes all the information, and actually outputs in plain language insights, actions, organizes it into shareable PowerPoints on its own, that sort of thing. And so this third generation of AI really allows commercial or medical business folks to speak in plain human language with the system, get results in plain human language, and skip some of those intermediate steps. And so this third generation covers everything really from how we can gather information all the way through the idea of being able to present the findings across the organization and track action. So these are kind of the three flavors of AI. When we talk about AI generally, what I will say is depending on the problem you're trying to solve, AI approaches will differ. So solving an AI problem for making a better decision at point of care is very different than this. Solving AI problem for what is the next set of slides I should deliver to Dr. Paul next time I see him based on what he's doing is a very different problem than this sort of market level insights management. But for market level insights management, these are the three approaches, and the technology is changing quite a bit. And I look forward to discussing that. So back to the case study in this particular example, the business team implemented a third generation AI tool. It took about 90 days to do that in a proof of concept. And what they found was that while they had assumed over the last 2 years they had done a really good job educating the marketplace in terms of the availability of the treatment and its clinical improvement, they found that that actually wasn't the case, and that 22% of the relevant HCPs had no knowledge at all of the treatment. And part of that was because while they thought they had done a great job of education and trying to understand why that was what they were seeing in practice was different, what they heard back was that, well, we don't really have KOLs, we have STLs. And what's an STL, the leader asked. It's the same 12 leaders. We meet with the same 12 leaders all the time for everything, and they know all about us. And so that was really shaping their view of how wide they had kind of spread the education. They also knew that their delivery mechanism was more complicated, and they were still working on some of the market access pieces. They kind of knew both those things, but what they hadn't really understood is the relationship that if I can't get access to a drug easily, there's no reason for me to learn about it on the provider side. And so they weren't really appreciating the interrelationship between the difficulty and access and that lack of education. And then ultimately, by solving this, they're able to put together broad education programs that drove hundreds of hours of savings, started to move that needle beyond that 22%, and most importantly, were able to show impact, which raised medical affairs profile within the organization in this case. So that's an example of a real world application of trying to make a difference in a strategy, using these sorts of tools, learning what needs to be done, then implementing actions and continuing to track those over time. So with that, I covered a lot of things. Again, a case study, a quick primer on insights management, and a quick way to look at the different flavors of AI that I'm sure we're going to talk about over the next 45 minutes. So I will stop and turn it back over to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance. That's a great place to start. And I love the way you kept that in plain English. I'm sure there's many non-techie people following this webinar. Before I get a response from the other panelists, I know we're going to throw out, there we go, another poll for you. We sort of asked you before around a straw poll on where you are or where you think your organization is. This poll is asking you where you think you've got the greatest challenges facing your insight process. And I'd love you to cast your votes. We're not going to call out how anybody's voting. We just want to get a quick straw poll of where you are. And just while you're doing that, I think a couple of things that came to my mind listening to you, Lance, and themes that we'll probably cover off today is, where with these kind of AI-driven platforms are we gaining efficiency? We're doing things that we've always done much more quickly. And where are we actually able to do new things that we perhaps couldn't do before? I'm also quite intrigued as to what Gen 4 might look like, and maybe we'll get onto that at some point further down the webinar. But we've got some votes coming in now. I'm just looking at how that's coming through. We'll give that another 20 or 30 seconds or so, and then maybe close that and just pop the results up, because that would be interesting as well to see what our panelists feel to that. Maybe it'll surprise you. So if you haven't cast your vote in now. And I think we can probably share the results at this point, just to give a sense of where people are. So there we go, organizing, integrating and analyzing all available data. The sort of data challenge that we touched on there, 38% of you. And then sharing insights, and obviously, Lance, you touched on the difference between observations and insights. Sharing insights, sharing even observations, I guess, can be challenging. The labor involved in insights analysis, so the efficiency play and so on. But that organizational, integrating, analyzing data seems to be the key thing that's worrying people there, and we'll perhaps touch on that. So let me allow my other panelists to introduce themselves. And I'd love to get their reaction to what you've presented, Lance, or their reaction to that poll. Neeraj, let me come to you first.
So I'm Neeraj Gourmittal. I head the data analytics and AI at Weave Healthcare, a global subsidiary of GSK. In terms of AI, I'm a very pro-AI person. So I do believe in Elon Musk's statement where he said that it is magic genie moment. We should make the most of it. So we cannot, or we should not, put the genie back in the lamp or bottle, but then we need to control it, of course. And as Lance was presenting, the three generations of Gen AI and the whole progression, like most of the data and digital leaders, I have seen the progression. So I do believe in the third generation because of the speed and scale and the productivity it provides us. It's just that we need to team it with the human beings. So yeah.
Yeah, and as you say, we can't put that genie back in the lamp or the bottle. It seems that we're going to be using this. It's all about how do we use it, where does it fit with the human being. So great observation. Carlos, let me come to you next again. Please introduce yourself and just give me your initial thoughts based on what you've seen.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Carlos. I'm the Executive Medical Director for Cardiovascular in Novartis. And actually, I really like what Lance presented because these three phases are actually what we are going through, or at least the first two phases. And now we're exploring the third phase or piloting it. So I would love to also share examples later on. But fully aligned that we need to enhance the process, but also as Niraj mentioned, it doesn't come only as a process. There's also the people and the capabilities that need to be in place because a tool alone will not do the job. You need to have the proper capabilities, the proper mindset, the proper support, investment in order to make the whole process a success. So looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, and again, that's something I think we've seen in multiple areas of technology over the last 20 years, is you can't expect the technology alone to give you all the solutions unless you're taking people with you. I know that's something that we'll explore in a bit more detail. Nate, let me come to you. And again, if you can introduce yourself and just give your initial thoughts.
Of course. Thanks, Paul. My name is Nate Lear. I lead advanced analytics and clinical trial efficiency at AstraZeneca within medical affairs and oncology. I really appreciated Lance, walking through some of those basic things and then tying it back to a real world example that, we can all relate to. I'm very keen to see how generative AI will transform the way that we work in a variety of different ways, even besides healthcare, just from a productivity standpoint over the next few years, but also really have a passion for the ways in which we can leverage machine learning today now with some of the real world data that we have to gain new insights about how patients are being treated, where they're being treated, and where there's opportunities to focus and target some of our strategies at a local level. Those are some of the areas of interest for me, but excited to engage in this discussion today.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, so we're going to roll up our sleeves and get into some of the questions, dive into some of these areas in a bit more detail. We had quite a lot of questions come in before the webinar, so we'll rattle through some of those. Just as a reminder for those of you watching this live, you've got the Q&A button. You can put your questions in during the webinar. And again, you can address them to a particular person. You can include your name if you choose to do so. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can. But I want to start by diving into this area of the key challenges. We saw the response to the poll there around just the data side, organizing, integrating data. I'd love to get your thoughts around where you've seen within your organizations, or I guess, Lance, in your case with your clients, where you've seen those particular challenges. And Niraj, let me come to you first on that. So what do you see as the key challenges, or what are you seeing as the key challenges?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So I think the poll also said, as first of the big challenges, which I truly believe is the biggest challenge, is the data quality, data availability as well, actually, as part of that. What we forget is that insights are based on data, and the whole principles of the data lineage in terms of data ingestion, data quality, data transformation, and data to action still applies. And that's the time then you can think of, generating the insights. And as part of that, sometimes because of the hype, sometimes we do see leadership expects the insights to be available, and data might not be available in exactly the format we need it for. So that's where, again, there becomes a gap in terms of data availability. And of course, we can talk about synthetic data and all of that, but I think that remains the biggest challenge so far. And second, of course, generative AI, as we know, that it can hallucinate. If it doesn't find the right data, it can make things up as well. So that remains another challenge. Biasness and fairness is another thing. We know that, whether it is social media or any of the data, historical data we use, when we use AI or Gen AI, it can be the whole bias on steroids. So everything can be so multiple fold. So we really need to be careful and observe. So our data science teams and everybody in the organization, we need to make sure we not only develop these models, but we observe and we see that, these are not biased and these are fair for everybody. The other challenge, I think, is bringing structured and unstructured data together. We all know that generative AI particularly is very good with content consumption, content generation, but then where we talk about the structured data, combining those two together, I think that's where we still are sort of, not there yet, and we're all thinking about it. Security, privacy remains another big thing. In fact, all the more because any small loophole can become a bigger one, and it'll be very difficult to scale it back because of the sheer scale of the whole AI thing. Another is human AI collaboration. As I said, the teaming up with human is very, very important. Otherwise, we can actually miss out on the quality and in fact quantity, because AI could give you 10 bullet points which nobody has time to read for, whereas a human being can kind of cut it down to the most important one. Compliance and regulations, that's another challenge. The same challenges which we had with data in terms of GDPR, etc. But then now with AI, we have acts coming up. So if EU Act is coming up and I'm sitting in the UK, I need to generate insights. I need to be careful around that. And last but not the least, measuring the impact, which was another kind of, in poll. I saw that it was one of the big ones. How do we sort of measure the impact which AI is making or these insights are making?
So it's fair to say there's a fairly long list of challenges, but we are working our way through those. And you can only do that, of course, by experimenting with this. So, Nate, I'd love to come to you. And just, is there anything you feel that Neeraj has perhaps missed that you're seeing in your organization, or particular bits that really resonate with you on those challenges?
Yeah, of course. I would kind of add the comment that I feel like the bar for success is continuously being elevated. And so that adds some challenges, specifically around the quality element where, previously we may have celebrated that we can actually unlock this insight. But as we continue to innovate, that's no longer sufficient enough. And so there's a lot of dialogue that we need to engage in, internally with the risk tolerance and how much risk are we willing to tolerate. And at the same time, are there ways where we can be more innovative in how we validate some of these outcomes so that we can continue to build trust in what we're delivering? But that, just going back to that ever increasing bar that we need to meet internally with some of these solutions to build that trust and to get the kind of adoption that we need with these tools.
So still a bit of a fear factor in there. Carlos, let me come to you. Anything you'd like to add on that? Anything different that you're seeing?
Well, they almost covered everything. Always a challenge to come in third, but maybe one point I would say is to really always ask ourselves the why question. Like, why do we want to invest? Why do we want to do that? If it's going to end up with a nice, shiny platform, but there is no one that is going to action those insights or really look into them and try to do something with those insights and improve, let's say, the performance of the platform. We know also that with AI, as we said, data comes in, good data goes out, but also there's a learning process where you could actually to learn along the way to become better and better. So unless you also want to invest time and money in order to make the process complete, as I said first, having the platform alone or having only the technology alone will not be sufficient. So it requires a lot of investment and commitment.
Yeah. And Lance, I kind of come to you last deliberately on this one. We obviously work with a whole range of different clients, and I guess you'll see some more common challenges. Any one or two things that you typically see that stand out for you?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just how quickly the technology is changing. And so this is not a space where in the next 5 years, things won't change very much and we can kind of take a breather and implement and slowly get a feel for things. Really, what was possible a year ago versus what's possible now is quite different. And that will be the same a year from now. And so just doing small proof of concepts, really working and trying new things is really, really important. Otherwise, you'll kind of miss that window. Then I think the second thing is really a challenge, I think, for the technology industry is that it needs to be simpler. And so right now we are still in a mode where if you were just, you joined an organization to help therapies get in the hands of the right patients, you may not have joined an organization to become specialized in technology or data science or AI or any of these things. And so I think as as AI is applied to different problems along the life cycle of a therapy, I think over time, the way that works will be more and more in the language that already exists for experts in that field in the business side, and that'll make this all easier to kind of grapple with. But part of the reason that tools like ChatGPT took off so quickly is because they were just so easy. And that needs to happen, I think, on the business side as well to really drive forward.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, I see some questions coming in now as we're going through this dialogue. And I think some of these we can maybe weave into, you know, your responses to other questions. So certainly questions coming in around what do you see as a preferred projects and methodologies? And a really interesting question that's linked to that around where do we start with this? What's a kind of small proof of concept? So maybe have a think about that as we come on to these other pieces. I did want to just look into how this might be changing the way that commercial and medical functions are operating in the concept of insights, which is something we touched on at the start. And Carlos, maybe I can come to you first on this one. Do you see it starting to change the way we gather insights and use them already?
Yeah, so let me give a bit of history, which will resonate a bit with what Lance was sharing at the beginning. So pre 2018, and by the way, my examples are going to be specific to global medical affairs. I'm not talking about sitting in a local organization, and also will be specific to medical, so mainly MSL insights in a way, or field medical insights. So pre 2018, there was this notion of gather insights, and something that really gives me an allergic reaction is when we say we want our MSLs to go gather actionable insights. Like, how would you gather an actionable insight? Are you going to go there and, you know, talking with the doctor and say, no, that's not an actionable insight, please, you know, proceed to the next point? So that for me always was a bit tricky. But we used to have this like CRM system. They would put the input, and then we have the medical writers who are extracting all that input, summarizing it, giving us a report. We would look at it. Definitely there will be some bias because maybe they will see something and say, nah, that's not relevant, or let's group these together and this falls out. Okay, we'll put it in the backup slides or whatever. And then you end up with what you actually want to hear. and you say, okay, those are the insights. Then in 2018 onwards, we started looking into what if we combine NLP with medical writers. So there were certain solutions, without naming them, where you would give them the raw data. They would use NLP to kind of create for you what is trending, what are the topics that are emerging, and really be able to summarize all that data in record speed. And at the same time, the medical writers would be looking into that and creating their own text in terms of summarizing and providing action points or suggestions. That worked really well because one of those things that we did helped in two ways. One way was to see a certain trending topic, and then when we addressed it with certain education and objection handling, we started seeing over time that this trending topic is being reduced. So that was a kind of an indicator that we are having impact, and we're seeing that topic trending down. And the other one was that we had a section for new topics that are emerging, where we saw a new topic emerging more and more. So then we did sort of a campaign to try and understand more if this is happening worldwide. And it led into evidence generation studies, led to an indication. So it really helped the business in terms of identifying something. Now, in 2020, we started looking into the platforms that do all the work without the need for medical writers. So you will just plug them into your CRM, and then they will automatically extract the data, and they will start showing you the trends and the topics. Of course, there are pros and cons because, you know, as everybody mentioned, it's not a medical writer that is kind of summarizing that. So sometimes you would see things that do not make sense, or topics that are not making sense. But what really helped with that is that there's no more pressure for the MSLs that go gather actionable insights. So now the MSLs, they feel confident that I could share an observation, I could share a fact, I could share an objection, and then the tool's job is to gather all that chatter, add to it social media, which was not as much prominent as before, add to it ad board reports, add to it Congress reports, add to it all sorts of information, and gives you this holistic picture of what you could actually do and what you could actually see. Apologies if it's a long answer, but I just wanted to give you a bit of the history on how we were seeing the impact with insights.
It's a really tangible sort of live example, which I think helps bring it to life to people. So thank you for sharing that. And it raises a question for me around the change management piece, which we'll come on to, because I'd love to know in the example you gave how the medical writers felt about this. Before we dive into that, Nate, Neeraj, and then Lant, will come to you. Just wondered if you were seeing other sort of changes you're seeing within commercial and medical as we look at this new way of gathering insights. Anything you wanted to add?
Nothing
So,
specific comes to me. Go ahead, Neeraj.
So I would say from commercial perspective, I mean, we do see generative AI as being very helpful in terms of upskilling the in-field teams, whether it is medical or commercial teams. I mean, whether we call it, next best actions, which they've been using. Although I know we had enriched our next best actions with classical AI, but with generative AI, they can get those suggestions in the most simplistic formats that this is what I need to do next, etc. And the second thing I would say is what Carlos mentioned in terms of MSLs. For example, that is a great example of the content consumption, but even for content summarization, because particularly for medical and in pharma industry, there are lots of congresses happen. And when you come out of these congresses, there is tons and tons of data, slides, and all of that, which is generated. So imagine all these MSLs spending all that time to sort of scan through or parsing through those slides and then coming up with the insights. And maybe, I mean, added on, compare with the last year, what was better this year, what was not. So all of this coming through generative AI within seconds. So I think that's a huge benefit we can see.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, Lance, I mean, you have a broad view across organizations here. Beyond what you've heard, do you see other changes coming through in commercial and medical because of this?
One of the things I think is what I call that combined AI, that third gen, combining the kind of traditional supervised and unsupervised AI models with kind of generative, is just the speed that companies can implement things and move forward is much, much faster. You don't need to spend months and months and months building lakes and dashboards and training models to really get started with some of these sorts of solutions. And so there's a lot more experimentation going on. And that I think is really healthy. I think seeing what works, what doesn't work for an organization, what we can learn, how we can move forward. So that's one big change that I see. I also certainly see a lot of folks, trying to predict what are the changes in roles. What's that going to mean? You mentioned medical writers. What does that mean to our traditional jobs and a way of functioning? I think AI, broadly speaking, really is going to do two things. There are going to be some processes where you can measure it in terms of how efficient it makes the process. Maybe I don't need all those medical writers in Carlos's example anymore because the machine is doing some of it, and those writers are more doing senior analysis, editing, maybe other things than just kind of summarizing raw, kind of mind-numbing sets of content. So there's an efficiency measure for a lot of processes that you can say, are we doing more with less? And then the flip side is the impact and the outcome. Carlos, I think, mentioned some very specific outcomes for his therapeutic area in terms of a new indication as a perfect example that wouldn't have otherwise have happened without implementing these sorts of tools. So I think in terms of impact, which I think is really, especially on the medical side, I think commercial kind of the KPIs and the ability to show ROI can be more straightforward. It's a little bit more difficult in the medical side. But I think these tools can really help show business impact in a much stronger way. I guess the third thing I'll say is bias, Nareesh, going back to what you were mentioning earlier. Bias is a massive issue. There are really, in my mind, two places where bias sneaks in. One is when data is gathered itself. If I have a set of questions, I'm going to keep calling Dr. Paul. I'm going to go keep meeting with Dr. Paul here, and I'm going to ask him, isn't my drug lovely? I'm probably going to get some answer. Yeah, sure. I guess your drug is lovely. And that's bias just inherent with how I'm actually gathering data. But then the second one, which is a little bit more insidious, is if I know that I have been trying to, educate physicians on why our mechanism of action is superior for the last 12 months, and I'm looking at a bunch of data, it's human nature to kind of look at all of those and try to find the things that validate, see, we've been successful. The data shows that we've been successful. The good news about an AI approach is bias doesn't work in the same way. It's not really out to prove something you already know in the same way. And so that can be really, really interesting and surface things that you otherwise wouldn't have seen. Bias in an AI context has more to do with the sorts of data that's being analyzed and some of the underlying mechanics of how it does that. But I think that case study I shared is a perfect example. The bias was we have done a tremendous job at education, and the reality was they had not. It took the machine to really show them that.
Which is a difficult message to get across, I'm sure. I see some questions coming in, by the way, asking for more specifics around tools and platforms. I'm not going to put our panelists on the spot because I know they can't always comment on these things, but obviously feel free to address those in your responses as we go through. But I did want to come on to this knotty subject of change management. It's a wonderfully simple term. It's a wonderfully complex subject, as you know, and Nate, it's a particular pet subject of yours, I know. But before I ask you to comment on that, let me just come back to you, Carlos, with the medical writers example, because I think in your example there, I heard you say that, you know, the medical writers were using AI and then it was almost using AI instead of the medical writers. That's quite a journey for them. How did they respond to that, and how did you manage that with them?
So to clarify, the medical writers plus AI, it was a third party's medical writers, not our own medical writers. Now, one thing that we always talk about, which is the human element. A medical writer's job profile does not, like, we don't hire medical writers because we want someone to look into an Excel sheet and summarize things. Medical writers have much more capabilities beyond this sort of like bureaucratic work or things that you do. And this is where people need to understand that AI is here not to replace humans, but to make humans more efficient and more productive.
Yep.
If I'm a medical director and I used to look into every session of the Congress and read the posters and the abstracts and the publications and spend maybe 4 days looking into all of that and all the data and trying to summarize it and combine it in my mind, that's 4 productive days that I'm working. Actually, I'm wasting 4 days to do all that work. But if I was able to use AI to give me like a summary or the key points, and then I could use those other 3 days to be more productive doing other impactful activities rather than just going through sheets of paper, then this will increase the productivity and the efficiency of a system or of a company. So that's the point. It's not like the medical writers lost their job, but they now are spending more time in creating maybe impactful publications or doing certain educational material that is more impactful for the MSLs. So that's the point that I want to say. And this is the change management that people need to understand. We're freeing time so that you're more productive in other tasks, so that you give them your 100%, instead of your power to be split 10% on 10 different projects, and you feel you're reaching burnout.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for all of us to let our job, our role be defined by the task we're doing rather than the value we bring and strategically what we're trying to do. So, Nate, let me come to you on this point, this change management topic. I'd love to hear your kind of learnings around perhaps right and wrong ways to go around this as much as you can share.
Absolutely. And it's a complex topic, right? And it really depends on your organization and where you're at. But you know, as many of us, I've been a part of many different projects and work streams where I've seen them fail at the last mile when they go to hand the baton, you know, from those that, you know, Lance, you walked through the different phases, that last step of delivering it to your business and to your internal customer for use and utility. And I've seen it break down in 2 main ways, and there's certainly more than 2, but 2 that I thought were worth summarizing, and some of those bubbled up in the survey responses, so it was reaffirming to see that. But the first is information overload. And so a lot of times we'll deliver AI generated solutions, but with that also a variety of other data points. And we'll deliver this in a new tool or a new application. And we're adding it to the suite of tools that, you know, our MSLs or our sales reps are using to do their business planning. And so we're continuing to cram more and more information into their business planning process. And so with that requires a lot of change management in order to alleviate that burden. Because if we're not alleviating that burden, then what happens is they start to disengage from these products and from data entirely. And so there are a few ways in which we can augment this. One is by having an individual who has more of a skill set in data analysis and analytics sit locally with our, you know, internal field-facing teams to have that dialogue of saying, here's what I'm interpreting from all the data that I'm analyzing, and to be able to translate that into a clear and effective action for someone who's in a customer-facing role. I think there's opportunities for Gen AI to fill that gap for leaner organizations that can't, staff that number of specialized roles. But on the other end of the spectrum, I've seen very little information given, where for some of our next best action solutions, we'll just be really targeted and say, here's who you should be having a conversation with, here's the message you should deliver, and the channel you should deliver it through. And that's the end of it. And so there's a lot of times like, okay, how do I know that this is the right insight? How do I trust that this is the direction that I should be going for my business? And there's a lot of, friction in there where it's like, oh, well, I experienced this once or twice. It wasn't helpful. So now I'm going to put that on the shelf and continue going about my business as usual. And so now we ask ourselves from a change management standpoint, how do we build and facilitate trust within our organizations? And kind of dovetails into one of the questions that was in the chat around how do we validate the outcomes of these solutions?
Right.
Whether it's machine learning modeling, AI, there's a variety of different techniques, and we need to find more ways to do that. I think that, we can leverage other data sources. We can look specifically within, certain institutions or health systems where we've got more concrete data. Can we pressure test these insights? But at the end of the day, we need to work on driving trust and transparency in how we're delivering these tools to our customers so that they can feel confident in the result.
Yeah, and you've picked up on a couple of questions I'm seeing, and Lance, I see you nodding vociferously as Nate is talking there, so I'm gonna come to you on this. But there's a natural, I guess, resistance to change the way we do things. So the question you picked up on, Nate, around in the example you gave, Lance, how did you know the AI-driven approach was right versus the one before? And another one I see in the chat, which is, well, reading a summary is never going to be the same depth of understanding as going through the full article and so on. So, and I'm not criticizing that. That's a natural reaction to that kind of change. So, Lance, how do we get over that? How have you seen that tackled?
I think first of all is really asking the question, if you're going to implement something or a tool that doesn't kind of cover the whole process, to ask the question, we're going to do this so then someone can do what? What is that exactly? I think what I see is a lot of these technologies get implemented. There's new dashboards, there's new, to Nate's point exactly, there's all these new things that are suddenly, in my workspace as a frontline user. And maybe all of those things are just to help me ultimately answer a question such as, is my medical strategy working or not? Should I be doing something differently or not? A lot of the AI tooling that you see, again, just kind of focusing back to this dashboard, the purpose of a dashboard is because humans aren't good at visualizing data. And so you have to implement all these dashboards in these systems so people can see charts and trend lines and things like that clearly. The question is, machines can visualize data just fine. So why not have the machine read the dashboard and tell you what the answer is? And have that be in line with your process, like in Nate's example, here is the next presentation, or here's the next set of messages that might make sense for your next encounter, and give that answer versus, hey, here's a dashboard and a chart that shows all the possible answers, and these are trending up and those are trending down. And you might notice if you look at it long enough that maybe you should double click on this one over here and do that. So I think implementing these partial solutions is what adds some of the complexity. And I don't think that's necessary, especially in that third generation of AI, where the system understands to a much better way how to actually share things in kind of human language. And that, I think, makes it easier to build processes that don't require as much training and understanding, certainly to not need additional sets of analysts and staff to explain the new tools to the end user as much as kind of that second generation tool sets do.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. And I have to say, we've got some fantastic questions coming in. I'm trying to keep on top of both the Q&A panel and the chat, both of which are fine, by the way. I feel like I could do with an AI assistant to screen through some of these questions. One thing I wanted to dive into more detail on, and this has come up in a few of these questions, is metrics, how we measure and we know we're being successful with this new way of generating insights in both the commercial and the medical sense. And Neeraj, perhaps I can come back to you on this one. If you can, share your observations on what are the right metrics to be looking at, commercial and or medical.
So One is, of course, as I think Nate and Lance also mentioned, in terms of the trust, and that's where the precision becomes one of the metrics. I know precision is something which is difficult because it is quantitative and qualitative measure, but then that's something which should be a metric in terms of how precise it is compared to the earlier process. So that should be one of the metrics. The second metric, which I always feel that in terms of, as we are talking about productivity, how much of productivity gain or time gain we have had in the organization. So time is money, we all know. So in terms of productivity, and which is where we already see things, but then what we are not doing is measuring the impact. So measurement framework is very important around that. And last but not the least is in terms of the cost. What is the sort of cost saving we are doing in terms of any expenditures? I mean, whether it was medical affairs or commercial side, whether it was spending time, for example, we had spent a lot of time, like other pharmaceuticals, in terms of customer segmentation, customer targeting, et cetera. Whereas with the help of AI and Gen AI, these things are becoming much more simpler, much more articulative, et cetera. So in that sense, we need to kind of be able to measure the cost effectiveness, cost gain. So in terms of cost and resource optimization, if we can have those metrics chalked down, I think that would be the start of the story. And of course, later on, we can have many more metrics which we can build upon this.
Yeah, and again, Nate, Carlos, I'd throw this over to you, and when you're presenting to your senior leaders, does what Niraj just presented there resonate with you? Perhaps Nate, if you want to comment first of all.
Yeah, it does. I would say that we're trying to pivot a little bit more towards patient outcomes, specifically within medical affairs. It's a little bit more straightforward on the commercial side, where you've got sales, new patient starts as a metric for which you can measure, okay, if I'm using AI to elevate a certain channel and engaging my customer, do I see an improvement in that channel's effectiveness as it pertains to that measure? Within medical, we've started trying to gain more confidence in how patients are being treated at a local level, so we can start to assess measures like guideline concordant care, and can we take that as a measure for which we then repeat a similar analysis? And the one thing I'll add is that for medical affairs, we're very focused in on KOLs, on those key opinion leaders. And so the added wrench is that we need to not just isolate that KOL and say, did our engagement with this KOL have an impact, but look at their network. And who are they influencing, and what is their, the peers around them? And do we see a change in that network's behavior, where whatever we're influencing from a KOL, we now see an improvement in that network's guideline concordant care over time. So adding that patient outcome element, because ultimately everything we do is in pursuit of improving patient care. So that's one thing we're trying to incorporate more, but it's challenging.
Yeah, recognizing that we're operating within complex systems. Carlos, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think they both covered it well in terms of the examples that I also gave examples of on impact. But I would like just to address one comment in terms of the summary. So just not to be misunderstood, it depends on what your job profile or your role is. There will be people maybe in the commercial team who would want to know headlines or summary and to try and identify maybe threats or competitive insights that then, if they are interested, they can go in depth and read into it. And of course, you have the people who need to know the science, like MSLs, who maybe need to go through all this document, but that's part of their job. So it also, we always need to, this is what I started with, to ask the why question before bringing a tool. And if the tool is going to help me get the job done, because at the end of the day, the tool needs to work for you and you don't need to work for the tool. So we don't bring the tool and we do the job for it, to make it to make it useful. It has to make our job useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. It almost becomes the summary is almost like the executive summary that guides you, but you're not losing the other information.
Exactly.
Now, I'm conscious we've only got 10 minutes left. We seem to have whistled through this conversation, and we haven't addressed one of the elephants in the room, which is in the title of the webinar, which is Can AI Reveal Real-Time Insights? And I'd like to dive into what does real-time insights mean to each of you in this context. Lance, you touched on this at the start, but maybe you could kick us off again on this and just sort of say what it means to you and where you see it being valuable.
Sure. So I would almost think instead of real time, it's at the right time is maybe a different way to think about it. So depending on the process you're talking about, if you're talking about understanding over time, is there an impact of our strategy by the actions that we're taking? It's unlikely that knowing something that comes in 30 seconds later, someone just left the doctor's office and had a comment. Does that change our whole world every 30 seconds? Probably not. But if you're in the middle of a launch, are you looking at information daily? Probably, certainly weekly or biweekly. As opposed to if you're talking about at a point of care, at the time of patients in the office, and real time might actually mean real time for the decisions you want to make. And so I think that understanding the problem you're solving, the natural cadence of how people interact across that process, the time that they need to do things, and making sure that when that time is there, they have everything they need to make the best decision possible at that moment. I think when either challenges with gathering the data, organizing the data, reporting on the data take longer than what that time frame is, that's when you get the frustration. And so I think for insights management, I think it is absolutely solvable to and is happening today in many organizations, to have these sorts of things at the fingertips and at that right time for people to make decisions about actions.
Yeah. Carlos, let me come to you on this. Any particular areas where you think this real time is particularly useful?
I think when I think again of MSL insights or Congress insights or ad board insights, so let's take MSL insights. If I'm an MSL and I put stuff into the CRM in January, if I'm gonna wait until April because in March is the cutoff date and they take all those notes and then they summarize them and then they share a report in April and then it's shared back with us with the actions. The question is, what would be the impact of something shared by experts or in countries in January, waiting until April or May to be actioned or to be considered? What would be the impact on the business? You might tell me, like in certain therapeutic areas where a very rare disease, maybe the insights are very scarce, or maybe that timeline would not have an impact, like quarterly or every 5 months is fine. But there are other therapeutic areas where maybe no, you need something more on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, or even monthly basis to analyze the chatter that is happening, especially if you're talking about a launch product or pre-launch. So for me, this is what a timely insight is really getting live chatter at the right moment and not having a delay of 4 or 5 months until you kind of get this analysis.
Yeah, let me come to you. Thank you, Carlos. Let me come to you, Neeraj, because all three of you work in what will be described as big pharma, but every company is different. So, Neeraj, does that resonate with you, what Carlos has described there?
Absolutely. So for me, timely is the word. And just a quick example, I mean, the other day I was reading a pharmaceutical where the wearable device can actually let the patients know, the diabetes patients know, whether they will be hypoglycemic while they're sleeping or blood sugar level will go down, and they can act accordingly. And imagine the whole patient outcome changed based on the timely information, even if it is not real time. So in that sense, it is that kind of information. But then, yeah, coming to our organization, where I was talking about the in-field team excellence, where our MSLs and reps, for example, can get timely insights, who they are going to talk to, what is their, channel preference, what is the person's inclination and all of that. So having that timely insight makes them very, very well equipped. And we're trying to explore that in multiple areas as well. So fully agree with the timely part.
Thank you, Neeraj. And Nate, I see you nodding along as Neeraj is saying that. Does that align with you?
Yeah, it does. And I would say specifically when we think about some of our real world data sources and trying to drive or derive timely insights about how patients are being treated, or what oncologists' behavior or sentiment is, a lot of the timeliness really comes at the expense of our data. Like, does our data capture this information and insight in real time? And what we see is generally, depending on the data source, there's quite a bit of lag. And so we actually will use AI to help offset some of that, lack of timeliness in the data that are available that we have in purchase. And so we're more talking about making predictions just to be able to deliver, as Lance was saying, an insight that is timely to our field teams and meet them at that point of engagement. But just with everything, it's important to consider the trade-offs, right? Because a lot of times we'll be pushed to deliver something that is just as accurate as concrete data, with some amount of a prediction looking forward 2, 3, 4 months or beyond. And so there's weigh, you have to assess and weigh the risks of predicting further ahead to get a timely insight versus having something that's more concrete, but perhaps is more retrospective.
Yeah, so real time is useful in the right area, but perhaps not for everything. I want to just acknowledge a couple of, I guess, more comments than questions. And it's a couple of people just reinforcing that AI should be there to enhance, not replace, and someone saying to the field teams, it's not going to replace you. I would be surprised if anybody on this call is going to disagree with that. I think we generally feel that the combination of people plus AI is more powerful than either alone. But if anybody does vehemently disagree, now is a chance to comment. No? I think we're pretty aligned on that. One really interesting topic that I've seen come up in the questions, and Lance, maybe I can bring this to you, but there's a couple of questions coming around. You were talking about bias, and there's a question coming around racial demographic bias. There's one that's more broadly around patient populations, and I guess that equity piece within research. Perhaps you can just comment on that and how these approaches are transforming that.
So I think from an insights point of view, I think what can happen with insight, with analysis that is less biased at that level, is it can surface some of those gaps, perhaps more clearly or quicker than you would otherwise notice them. What it doesn't do is fix the gap at how the data is being generated. If we're still enrolling non-diverse populations in studies, AI analysis is not going to help other than say this is still occurring. And so I think that, but in that part of the world, as an example, I know that there are a lot of companies focusing on how can we use these tools to optimize diversity within our clinical programs, and how can we speed some of the outcomes on that front. And so the cool thing about where we sit right now, back to the genie out of the bottle, maybe ending on that point, is we've been talking this whole webinar about insights. You could have a webinar like this talking about the impact of AI on almost every problem across the entire life cycle, from R&D through commercial and back. And there would be a set of folks just like this, probably sharing some really interesting things about how we're trying to solve those problems. That's what makes it fun. It also makes it scary. But I think, also with Carlos's point, so far, I think a lot of what we're seeing is just the part of the job that's dull and repetitive and drudgery. Those are a lot of the problems that AI is solving right now, which is kind of freeing people up to be doing why they joined life science company to begin with, which is to help develop drugs and put them in the hands of the right patient, as opposed to reading spreadsheets all day.
It's a great comment. And on that point, noting we are into the sort of final couple of minutes or so, which I can't believe we've got there. And sorry if we haven't got to your question, but I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of just sum up, because we all work in this industry because we want to make a difference to patients, and insights is a first sort of stage in that. So 30-second answers, please. I'd love to get your thoughts around, where you think this kind of AI-driven insights will most transform how we operate in the context of delivering benefit for patients. Quite a big question. Carlos, I'm going to throw this at you first. Sorry.
No, maybe I would like to instead give a certain advice, because I saw some questions around pilot and stuff like that. We are, or I will speak about myself. I'm not the AI expert of insights here, but one thing I wanted was to be curious in terms of trying something and see if it can lead somewhere nice. And this is what we did in terms of a pilot. Start small. If people start thinking about, oh, I'm going to bring this huge AI, I'm going to incorporate it everywhere and insights from everywhere in the world, they're going to see a very big sum that they need to pay, and then they will just freeze and say it's not going to happen. Start small. Choose one therapeutic area, choose one country, try it, see if it leads to an impact or people are feeling better with the insights that it's generating, and then expand and build on that. But don't be afraid to start small, to just try out or pilot something. So that would be my final advice.
Great advice. Thank you, Carlos. Neeraj, I'll come to you next, either to my question or to give your advice as Carlos has done.
So I would say exactly, I agree with Carlos that, it should be value driven. It should not be just for the sake of, hype that, because Gen AI is there or AI is there, I should be doing that. And then I think for me, the biggest benefit is the amount of data AI and Gen AI can deal with, where it's not just the visible data of a patient, which is on paper, but then there are lots of invisible data in terms of social demographic and economic conditions and all of that, and where it can combine all of data and give personalized insights. So really kind of looking forward to those that sort of vision where it can provide those insights for patients.
Thank you, Neeraj. Nate, I'll come to you. Your closing thoughts?
I echo the sentiment from both Carlos and Neeraj. I would say I encourage folks to take a calculated risk and to view, any sort of failure as a learning experience. And with this rapid pace of innovation, a lot of the things that we're experimenting with now may be obsolete in a few years, but you'll take with you the learnings that you gained from that experience. And then as it relates to patient benefit, I mean, the drug discovery is a huge area in which I think AI is going to really accelerate the quality of treatments that are being delivered to patients over the next few years. And then the quality of care for those patients can certainly be augmented. Everybody understands and realizes the importance of having that personal element of care, but to be able to receive for an increasingly complex treatment landscape, within oncology and just in general across the board, for AI to be able to come alongside and provide support in enabling and ensuring that patients get optimal care, I think will be critical.
Thank you, Nate. And Lance, any final words from you on this?
I'll just say that, in my mind, AI is not a strategy. It's how you do things. I think the strategy is to affect some business result or business change that you are dealing with, depending on where you are within the organization. And understanding what are the latest ways that companies are trying to solve that, which probably are going to involve AI in some way in these days, is maybe a way to think about it versus trying to become an AI expert, which I don't think the majority of us will ever need to do.
Yeah, great comment. We don't need to be the technical experts. We just need to know how to use these things and how it can transform our business.
Correct.
Let me draw things to a close by again saying thank you to Reuters for organising this. Thank you to Within3 for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you, of course, to all of my panel here. I think we've covered a lot of ground in the last hour. You've shared some great insights and some very practical insights. Thank you for that. And of course, thank you to all of you who've been listening in. I apologise if we haven't got to your question. We've had a lot of questions come in, but feel free to connect with the folks here. I'm sure they're happy to discuss more in detail offline. But thank you very much for listening. This will be on demand after this live webinar. So if you missed the beginning, go back and watch it again, share it with your friends. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you very much.